Good evening, and welcome to the Got Ancient Wisdom live stream, where we're doing a continuing the read through of Stan Gooch's 1972 book Total Man. Who we got so far with us? I'm looking a bit weird on the screen. I'm starting to look a bit ghostly. Trevorn Wright, hello Trevorn, and Ralph Hexham in early, I see. I hope everyone's got their petrol. The only way out is in. Hello. Yeah, I hope everyone's got their petrol and stuff, and not panicking too much. Just to be quite honest, I'm sort of looking forward to it all. Yeah. So I'm going to carry, because we've got quite a long chapter to get through, so I want to just carry on with chapter 10, Old and New Men, the recent evolution of the nervous system. Unless anyone's got any points to raise or anything like that. No? Then we shall proceed. So I think the last bit we've done was we're starting to get into why nature produced two generalized types of early man. So we've got the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal type, or Neanderthaloid, Cro-Magnon opposites. The only way out is in. Yeah, I want it all to fall. Yeah. It's the most polite way of putting it. I just find it's the most polite way of saying it to people when they say, "Oh, it's getting bad, ain't it? Oh, it's getting, they're saying the shop's going to be empty now," and then saying it. And the most polite way I can say it is, I just think we should just let it all fall. Because anything else they'll probably find a bit too extreme. But yeah, I also want some kind of great reset, but not the way that they want the great reset. We're Europeans. We'd build back better. All their catchphrases. I'll use all their catchphrases. We'd do it all. Yeah. So we got to. The Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal. We're right in the beginning of chapter 8, really. So if anyone's just joining us, we've got quite a good chapter coming up, getting into the hybrid origin stuff. I'm just seeing where I actually got to. Might have to just walk it back a little bit. I'll start here. While the view just expressed, and that was the view that to have shown that owners of suggestively modern skulls were living in various parts of the world well before the advent of Cro-Magnon, is not to have proved conclusively. So Stan Gooch is proposing that that nature had attempted to create a neanthropic man, a more Cro-Magnonoid man over and over again, but they'd failed, and that there was a certain, environment. Actually, I think his view on the environment versus genetics changes a little bit later on. But I'm not sure what one that's in. I think that might be personality and evolution, which is going to have some interesting takes on evolution. Actually, some things you might not have thought about. While the view just expressed has something to recommend it is not, on the whole, my own. In particular, as stated, I reject the view that Cro-Magnon evolved in the Near or Middle East from the mixed Neanderthaloid populations whose remains we find there. I adopt instead the current majority view that Cro-Magnon evolved elsewhere and thence invaded Europe via the Middle East, overrunning and at least partially destroying the Neanderthal populations as he did so. And now we have a quote from A.S. Romer. That Neanderthal man was wiped out, that he was perhaps harried and exterminated by invading groups of Homo sapiens who had come from an entirely different line of ancestors. Yes. On the whole, and this is from Ralph Selecki, on the whole, the evidence seems to indicate that Neanderthal man did not gradually change into sapiens, but was replaced, presumably, by an invading sapiens. Two sets of Middle Eastern remains have been found near Mount Carmel and are known as the Tabun and the Skull group, respectively. Both are dated approximately 75,000 BP, but the Tabun remains precede those of Skull by some 10,000 years. Some individuals in both groups, particularly in the former, are rather typically Neanderthal, while others are not. The foreheads are reasonably full, although the brow ridge is rather prominent, the skull somewhat vaulted, and so on. Looking at such findings, it is at first easy to imagine a people undergoing rapid transition to a neanthropic type. One must, however, then ask why such a change should be occurring at that particular juncture, but more pointedly, why it should be occurring so rapidly. From the viewpoint of the evolutionary clock, a period of a few thousand years, is a very short one indeed, unless perhaps at a time of exceptional pressures. In any case, it is equally reasonable to imagine that at Mount Carmel we have a half-breed population resulting from an admixture of Neanderthals or Neanderthaloids with an initial wave of Cro-Magnon or Cro-Magnonoid peoples. The chief and perhaps only weakness in the theory of Cro-Magnon having evolved outside the Middle East lies in the fact that no trace of his alleged home site have yet to emerge. At this stage, however, we halt the examination of accepted facts and the various variant explanations of these in order to present the views of the present book on the material thus briefly reviewed. It will be seen that accepted facts are not violated, although certainly extended and interpreted. These extensions will help us further in the description and understanding of the structure of personality. It is suggested first that man has been marked since his inception by a strong urge to be somewhere else, that is, by migratory tendencies connected in all probability to the high curiosity drive displayed by all primates. Many considerations support this view, one being, as far as this book is concerned, the central role which the wanderer or pilgrim occupies in legend, literature and religion. There is in any case no lack of evidence of an urge to travel amongst people today. There are, nonetheless, also compelling biological reasons why this must have been the case with our early ancestors. Darwin, and many others since, have shown that when representatives of a particular organism or plant are isolated from the parent population, they, in the course of unspecifiable time, and by reason of the selective pressures of the environment in which they find themselves, evolve into a species ultimately incapable of interbreeding with the original parent stock. This process is the origin of species. When the isolation from the parent stock is recent or is not total, or is total but intermittent, different varieties of the species will emerge, which, though showing inter-variety dissimilarities, are still capable of interbreeding with the parent population or with other varieties. Though one can never speak with certainty in these matters, it is highly probable that any variety of man cut off from others for a period of even, say, 100,000 years would have evolved into a separate species. Some support for this view is provided by classic Neanderthal. The period during which this community was isolated from the rest of mankind by the Würm glaciation is estimated as not exceeding 40,000 years. In this short time, however, though admittedly under extreme environmental pressure, Neanderthal had already advanced a fair way along the road to becoming a distinct species. In a period of some 18,000 years of isolation, the Aborigines of Australia too had begun to develop peculiarities of genetic transmission. We see, therefore, that it is extremely unlikely that any early men were at any time isolated for indefinite periods from their fellow man, since otherwise separate species of man would almost certainly have emerged. The notion of early man as a continual and compulsive wanderer would account for the fact that the remains show mixed characteristics found at widely scattered points through time. but more importantly, for the non-emergence of separate species of man. It seems that as soon as specialization in a particular direction got fairly started, the amicable or forced intermingling with other varieties tended to dilute and otherwise thwart the specialized trend, producing in the event something like a regression to the mean. Nor must one imagine that the circumstances operating against too great a specialization applied only to anatomy. They applied equally to inherited behavior. We consider further reasons why the concept of man as a continual energetic migrant is especially useful. Pre-man and early true man were well suited for migration, and became still more suited once this was taken up. For the first ape man was a fair walker, a good climber, both of rocks and trees, was prepared and able to eat, and moreover could obtain almost any kind of food, from roots and tree produce to small, later larger animals, including fish and shellfish. He was capable of constructing shelters, as some modern primates do, or could sleep in a tree or in caves as necessary. Ultimately, he had the protection of fire, but long before this had simple weapons to serve as equalizers between him and the fiercer animals. Clearly, early man was the almost perfectly equipped traveller, one capable of coping with almost any kind of terrain. Importantly, it was probably in the course of and as direct result of travelling that man became a useful swimmer, a generally unprimate activity. There must have been numerous occasions when the ability to struggle somehow across or simply into a stretch of water meant the difference between life and death, when trapped by carnivores or by fire, when pursuing game in times of food scarcity, or at such times being able to dive in shallow seas. These particular situations and selection procedures would obviously arise far less frequently in the case of primates who were prepared to limit themselves to one known area, if not one sleeping place. These played it safe, but at the point of reaching an evolutionary dead end. There is no such proverb, but one might say, "He who stays in the trees does not learn to swim." Pretty good. We have suggested that the notion of the continuous crossing of incipient varieties of man, made possible by his keeping on the move, can account fairly neatly for the regular occurrence of mixed populations. There was, for primitive man, however, a further and unsought bonus from this situation, and for us a similar bonus in increasing our understanding of the progressive evolution of man's personality. When two varieties of a species are crossed, the resultant offspring often, though not necessarily, display what is termed hybrid vigor. This is to say, the offspring are frequently sturdier in many or all ways than either parent, sometimes on a purely additive basis, sometimes in ways not predictable from one's knowledge of the characteristics of the parents. Such crossing is the principal tool of the animal and plant breeder, searching for new qualities or desirous of strengthening old ones. A final point is that hybrid vigor is more likely to arise when well-differentiated varieties are crossed, rather than fairly closely related varieties, especially if the varieties in question are themselves somewhat inbred. So, going away from the text, there's something that you always hear from people pushing the idea of multiculturalism. And that is that they say that there's more similarities between two people from the same country than there is between two people from different... what is it? There's more similarities between two people from different continents than there are between two people from the same country. So they'll say, you don't realize it, but you've got much more in common with an African than, genetically. You've got much more genetically in common with an African than you have with someone from Devon. So why doesn't that sort of defeat the idea of multiculturalism, that you're bringing something new to this? Because if you're the same as somebody from Africa, then wouldn't that be just like interbreeding? Whereas if you've got less in common with someone from Devon than you have from someone in Africa, then wouldn't it be better to breed with someone from Devon? I don't know. That side of it's never really made sense to me. So back to the book. Can one not assume that under the conditions hypothesized, differing varieties of man would interbreed on numerous occasions, in some cases after thousands of years of genetic isolation, and that the offspring of these crosses might demonstrate improved hybrid qualities, including such qualities as intelligence? One notes that since man is a cultural animal, because, that is, he lives in tribes which maintain continuity of learning, and because he's young, during their long period of dependence, absorb and are specifically taught the learnings of their elders, and for all these and other well-known reasons, any advance produced by some particularly gifted generation or individual will, of course, then tend to be preserved and to become the permanent property of the community. It is a possibility that the peoples with mixed characteristics of skull and taboon were the result of one of the last crosses between widely divergent hominid populations, perhaps the last such cross possible, since from there on the growth of civilizations and sheer numbers tend to preclude the possibility of lengthy genetic isolation. It may even be, as I believe, that what we term civilization emerged as a direct result of that last cross. This point will be taken up again. We've got quite a long general note here on this page, so I'm going to read it. In this particular context, I suggest that parts of the Old Testament and the pseudepigrapha, which describe the sons of God mating with the daughters of man, are actually a stylized dream account of the passage of Cro-Magnon through the Near East some 35,000 years ago. If this is so, our ideas of the timescale in human history would need to be drastically revised. Let us consider very briefly what could cause us to see a connection between Cro-Magnon and certain legendary figures of the Old Testament. We need to imagine, on the one hand, the figures we have already described, a race of probably skilled warriors, average height 6 feet, handsome, well-proportioned men with high foreheads and well-formed chins, perhaps largely devoid of body hair. Probably the Greek ideal of manhood, or our own present-day Olympic athletes, of field rather than track events, would be a reasonably close approximation. These are to be contrasted with, on the other hand, the typical Neanderthaloid of the Middle East and Near East, not of course with classic Neanderthal. He lay much further west. Short, thick-set, probably fairly hairy, with recessive forehead, possibly a hairline close to the eyes, and a recessive chin. Might not Neanderthal have perceived something godlike in this new invading race? How might it be, too, if the children of the alleged cross between Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthaloids possessed a marked degree of hybrid vitality? Is there any evidence of such a possibility in the old writings? The answer is affirmative. First, a brief excerpt from the Book of the Secrets of Enoch. And there appeared to me 2 men, exceeding big, so that I never saw such on earth. Their faces were shining like the sun. Now the well-known passage from Genesis 6:4. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. The Nephilim, giants, were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. The meaning of the last sentence is not wholly clear. As commentators agree, are the mighty men referred to the sons of God, or the children of the sons of God and the daughters of men? Probably the latter. J. Hastings, in his Dictionary of the Bible, 1900, under Nephilim, notes first that a more accurate translation of when in the sentence and also afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of men is for as much as, i.e. because or as a result of the fact that. He continues, it is not explicitly said that the Nephilim were the heroes born by women to the sons of God, and some scholars have held that they were not. But the writer of Genesis certainly meant that they were, for otherwise it is impossible to account for his mentioning them at all. The biblical text itself, then, is, and the majority of commentators unite in assigning miraculous qualities to the offspring. Many primitive and isolated peoples, such as present-day Eskimos, incidentally refer to themselves as the men. just as the writer of Genesis did, out of their belief that they were the only men on earth. There is much else here that is fascinating and germane, over which we can unfortunately not linger too long. Thus, Numbers 8:32-3, and all the people that we saw in that land are men of great stature. And there we saw Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Might not Cro-Magnon have contemptuously regarded the fecund when men began to multiply on the face of the ground, diminutive Neanderthals, and they themselves as grasshoppers? This is particularly appealing when finally Hastings tells us among the derivatives proposed for Neanderthal, one makes it to be from Nafal, to fall. This goes back to, obviously, the cerebellum. Either as meaning beings fallen from a previous higher state, or as fighters who fall upon the enemy fiercely. The latter view has been favoured by the Greek versions. Is this a reference then to the fighting qualities of Cro-Magnon? Finally, the relevance here too of the literal symbolic meaning of David and Goliath legend needs perhaps hardly be mentioned. Okay, so to fall, they fell upon the daughter. Yeah, I see what he's saying there. They fall upon the daughters of the earth. So they fall upon them in battle. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Interesting. So back to the book. For the moment, let us track back again to the millennia preceding these possible events. It was earlier suggested that fairly continuous mixing of varieties of man would produce, amongst other things, a kind of anatomical regression to the mean. That is, on the one hand, physical characteristics of man were in general prevented from becoming too divergent, the one exception here being classic Neanderthal, who, significantly, was precisely in that position of being isolated from the main body of mankind. And not only was a limit thus set to physical divergences, but on the other hand to behavioural divergences also. One can hypothesize further that during the course of evolution, along with increasing powers of reasoning, for example, certain individuals saw the advantages of a permanent home site. Of course, there may have been other and less conscious reasons for that decision also. We are not committed to assuming only single causes. One can, for instance, suggest that within the normal range of variability of the species, perhaps involving whole varieties, some individuals were less disposed temperamentally to continuously moving on. The tendency might be reinforced by the discovery of a particularly fertile stretch of country, by a growing attachment to a personal possession, or whatever. For some or all of these reasons, at least some members of a tribe, which perhaps in any case had grown too large for convenience, might decide to settle. We may suggest two further points: that settling down, once a certain ability to cope with environment had been developed, conferred at least as much survival potential as keeping on the move, and that secondly, the gene pool of the permanent settlers, already perhaps differing, came by processes of natural selection to differ further from the gene pool of those who continued a nomadic existence. This last implication would tend to hold even more true for behaviour and customs. One can imagine that these attempts on the part of early man to settle proved abortive in the sense that sooner or later a tribe of more or less aggressive strangers would appear over the hill and help themselves to whatever was going on, including the women folk. This is a possible pattern still clearly visible in early historical times. The adoption of women of the conquered tribes into that of the conqueror, has probably always been fairly standard practice. The biological benefit here is that genes from the settlers are incorporated into the gene pool of the migrators. This would have the effect of, fairly literally, slowing down the conquerors, i.e. of reducing the migratory and perhaps the aggressive urges in future generations, if these are genetic. On other occasions, the nomads might not wipe out the entire settlement, merely plunder and move on, leaving as mementos a seeded crop of half-breed babies. On yet other occasions, still, the meetings and minglings of wanderers and settlers might have been wholly amicable. All such events, in any form, would nevertheless, on the one hand, have prevented settled groups from degenerating into any kind of pastoral idiocy, and migrating groups from becoming totally, if the phrase is appropriate, dehumanized. In a limited sense, but only in a limited sense, it is possible to say that settling behaviour eventually, in evolutionary terms, won out over migrating behaviour. The struggle is by no means wholly played out, however, as a brief consideration of modern society shows. In the context of this discussion, perhaps one should emphasise that settler, in any case, does not and cannot mean farmer until about 11,000 BP. Prior to this period, crops were not cultivated. When one speaks here of a settlement, one means essentially the establishment of a permanent dwelling site, which is thereafter inhabited by the descendants of the founders in a perhaps extensive neighbourhood capable of bearing continuous hunting or foraging. In the terms of this book, I propose the establishment of a permanent settlement as a B1 phenomenon. In our present society, for instance, it is men far more than women who travel, explore and discover, and are, in all senses, more generally restless. Marriage, significantly enough, is referred to as settling down. To the migrators, one is inclined to assign a more masculine, aggressive and ego-based, that is, belonging to the type A, capital B2 personality. This is an assumption. However, Cain's reply to God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" is typically ego-assertive and truculent. Cain is saying, "Who do you think I am? His mother?" Jack Kerouac, if poetic evidence is admissible, said that ego is the greatest hobo. Let us apply these generalizations to Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. If the Cro-Magnons were indeed warlike men with a fairly high level of practical intelligence, this would be more likely to make them the victors in a clash with all Neanderthals. If the Neanderthaloids were less fierce, less intelligent in a practical sense, perhaps preoccupied with religious ceremonial, etc., having essentially a B, capital B1, B2, A profile, they would not constitute a formidable threat to Cro-Magnon. Classic Neanderthal was a rather different matter. One is tempted to assign him a capital B1, capital B2, lowercase a profile, a somewhat unusual profile, but then classic Neanderthal is somewhat unusual, implying that he was partly a fierce but not especially well-organised fighter. One can imagine that if classic Neanderthal fought his own kind, it was as the result of shortage of food, not out of a desire to conquer or a joy in combat. We are here, naturally, wholly in the realm of speculation. There is, however, at least a possibility that classic Neanderthal was cannibalistic. This is strongly suspected of certain paleoanthropics outside Europe. The most likely prima facie use for the curved arm and thigh bone would seem to be wrestling or hugging, and the most likely object for this style of attack would be other Neanderthalers. Neanderthalers. Weird word. That would even appear a reasonable and possible basis for the evolution of curved limbs, but there is another, far more arresting possibility to which we shall come later. Cro-Magnon, essentially modern anatomically, as authorities unite in agreeing, pushes up into Western Europe from the east around 35,000 BP. From that time on, large numbers of anatomically pure Cro-Magnons are found in Europe. There is the question, as mentioned, whether he originated in the Near East or whether he arrived there fully evolved from some other part of the world. This book siding, as indicated, with those who argue the latter. I envisage several waves of migration, or one rather piecemeal and drawn-out migration, the first part of which faltered and came to a halt in the Near East. Here, these new-style men settled and in course of time intermingled with local Neanderthaloid populations. The major, later wave of Cro-Magnon, I suggest, progressed intact through the Near East, no doubt leaving further mixed marriages in its wake, but nevertheless not taking strangers into its ranks, to reach Western Europe. The significance of the uncontaminated condition of the groups arriving in Western Europe appear to have been largely underrated. Those who would argue for the evolution of Cro-Magnon from a mixed but basically Neanderthaloid population in the Near East have the task of explaining not only how the separation into a pure modern strain took place there under conditions of not better than relative isolation in the comparatively brief space of some 30,000 years, but how then these pure individuals but nobody else took off for Western Europe. Mixed types, moreover, persist in the Near East and Eastern Europe very much later than the time in question. It is on balance much less difficult to imagine the evolution of Cro-Magnon taking place outside this whole arena in the greater isolation of the Far East or Africa. This being as it may, we arrive at the point where a pure Cro-Magnon population appears in Western Europe. Relatively pure descendants of these invaders, incidentally, survive today in the Dordogne, the Canary Islands, Scandinavia and elsewhere, a fact universally agreed in the specialist literature. Now, Cro-Magnon is confronted by a people of perhaps repellently, even horrifyingly animal appearance, squat, immensely powerful, perhaps excessively hairy in evolutionary response to the rigour of the climate, with jutting brows, jutting muzzle and flattened skull. Did one speculates Neanderthal's style of fighting involved the use of his mouth, and were the brows there therefore to protect the eyes? Still more, what of the massive head as a whole with its thick bones? Did Neanderthal run at his enemy using the lowered head as a battering ram? We shall have significant occasion to raise this point again. Was Cro-Magnon's reaction to classic Neanderthal only one of physical horror or disgust at his appearance, or the conditions in which he lived? Or are there perhaps grounds for postulating a superstitious fear also? We do know, of course, that Neanderthal practiced ritual burial of the dead. What further religious ceremonies, one wonders, might he have also practiced? Cro-Magnon had, perhaps, been prepared to acknowledge his kinship, his common humanity, with the Neanderthaloid peoples of the Near East, possibly in a wholly contemptuous, dismissive way. That view is strongly supported by the circumstance that no Neanderthaloids were allowed to accompany Cro-Magnon into Western Europe. Perhaps the Cro-Magnon male considered Neanderthaloid women an excellent fuck and made full use of that facility while disowning the half-breed offspring. But classic Neanderthal was something else again. Here, possibly for the first time, Western man's consciousness would have been confronted by the inescapable evidence of his own animal origins. The psychological mechanisms of denial would ensure his making every effort to destroy that evidence. It is tempting to allow the imagination full rein in this area. One can picture perhaps a period extending over many generations of continual slaughter of the native classic Neanderthal population, possibly the first systematic pogroms. Perhaps, too, a time when internal schisms within Cro-Magnon tribes occurred about how to deal or come to terms with the Neanderthal problem, accompanied also by the purging on the part of extremists of any liberal elements in the Cro-Magnon ranks. These phrases and the situations they suggest may seem out of place in this context. Yet, why should we imagine that Cro-Magnon differed significantly from ourselves in anything other than a lack of our technical skill? The picture of systematic slaughter indicated here might also have seemed less likely prior to the last World War. Now it would seem only too possible. Still, the deliberately political drift of the comment made may yet appear misplaced in respect of our primitive forebears, who perhaps, it can be argued, did not even possess a language. Doubts on this score, however, are probably groundless, while of course in the absence of writing we cannot have direct evidence of whether any particular variety of early man did or did not possess a language. One may make inferences based on other behaviour. Already 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus had the use of fire, a tool culture, lived in permanent cave sites and practiced cooperative hunting. It would seem unlikely that even then some primitive form of communication can have been totally absent. I am, personally, not in doubt that a complex language and perhaps a complex social order could have and did exist by 35,000 BP. The notion behind the phrase purging of the liberals, for instance, of some selective process of survival or non-survival, is necessary from one important point of view. For this book wishes to suggest that some of the fear of Neanderthal or of Neanderthal qualities was bred into the ancestors of Western Europeans at this time, became constitutionally, that is, genetically fixed. Many hundreds, even thousands of years of bitter, continuous fighting could have formed an adequate selection mechanism. The general view of this book, as already proposed, is that legends and stories, no matter how they originate, do not persist unless they contain some psychological truth or satisfy some inner psychic necessity. Though they frequently derive from actual events or the lives of actual people, Abraham, Robin Hood, the Trojan Wars, or arise out of some factual error such as the reporting of canals on Mars, they survive and grow, one suggests, for other reasons. Turning the view around, one argues also that all details of a legend, no matter how trivial they may seem, are each of the greatest importance. That is to say, there are no chance inclusions. Freud, of course, took this view of the dream. Let us look again at the paleoanthropic or Neanderthal skull with its projecting brow, the pronounced bi-arched supraorbital ridge, as they are called. The hominid 9 skull offers here the best example of this brow formation. If now we look again, are we not looking at the skull of the devil? Are not these his horns? Let me see if I've got... I don't know if I've still got them up. Hold on. Yeah, so you can sort of see from the skulls that you do have the supraorbital ridge, the bony crest over the eyes. In proposing this view of the devil's physical origins, one is in no sense going back on the interpretation of the devil offered in chapter 8 and the link with the cerebellum. But what we see in the skulls of the paleoanthropics is perhaps the actual physical basis of the myth. There is a good deal more to be said here, but let us first deal with two possible objections. One, even conceding a certain reasonableness in the suggestion that the form of the paleoanthropic skull could give rise to a much later stylized idea of men with horns, is not the time gap between ourselves and Neanderthals, some 35,000 years, too great to allow for the survival and handing down of the legend to modern times. Two, even if the concession is made regarding the survival of the legend over the very considerable period in question, why is it necessary to argue for the genetic fixing of the legend, that is, for a biological basis? Will not the handing on of the legend by word of mouth suffice to account for the facts? These two aspects are interlocked. If the second biological basis were established, for example, the first objection would be largely quashed. Let us, however, treat the two objections as separate issues. First, the time gap. Anthropologists and other involved parties are agreed that the Cro-Magnon is solely dominant in Western Europe by 25,000 BP. That must mean that others shared the environment with him till then. This is already something of an improvement on our earlier figure of 35,000 years. May one not ask, however, whether there was any conceivable way in which isolated remnants of classical Neanderthal could have survived even beyond that date. First, let us glance, as it were, sideways at another important find from Africa, Rhodesian man. This skeleton comes from Broken Hill in Rhodesia and is dated between 40,000 and 25,000 BP. The disagreement amongst authorities on a precise date rests on technical matters. While the body skeleton of Rhodesian man is thoroughly modern, the skull, which is what interests us at the moment, is wholly paleoanthropic. The brow ridges are described as simply enormous. The forehead retreats sharply, the vault is low, and the skull bone extremely thick. I think that's what we've got up on the screen there. Thus, whatever the fate of classic Neanderthal in Europe, it appears that men with horns were still perhaps flourishing elsewhere at a time when Cro-Magnon had become dominant in Europe. Reverting again now to classic Neanderthal, it seems likely that he was no longer at large in Europe proper by 25,000 BP. However, as we shall see later, until as recently as 10,000 BP, Scandinavia, like Tibet, was still in the grip of the glaciation of the last ice age, and in this state inaccessible to modern man. Could it be that a few small bands of Neanderthals eked out some kind of existence in such areas? The answer must be a tentative yes, for we note that stories of trolls, dwarfs and giants are coincidentally more common in the north of Europe, and that these mythical creatures supposedly lived in the mountains' inaccessible parts. And then, what do we find in Tibet? Stories of an ape-like creature living above the snowline. One certainly hesitates before mentioning the abominable snowman, the Yeti, in a serious context, but the legend is too useful to ignore. We are not suggesting that he is alive today, but that he may have been alive almost into historical times, since the legend, logically, cannot be more than 10,000 years old, due to the aforementioned glaciation of the area in question. Even if the foregoing suggestions in connection with the lingering of Neanderthal are unacceptable, what certainly seems likely is that occasional Neanderthal skulls would have continued to turn up from time to time, as they do very occasionally to the present day. Such finds could once again trigger off the retelling of the old tales. Viewing these various considerations and bearing in mind also that by 9000 BP Jericho is a flourishing modern town, is not the time gap between ourselves and classic Neanderthal, though still great, rather less formidable than it first seemed? But what in any case of our second suggestion, that the response to classic Neanderthal became genetically fixed? The general view of this book, as stated, is that oral traditions do not survive indefinitely, much less grow, unless they reflect some real psychological or physiological need or condition. In particular, our wholehearted, many-faceted and persistent acceptance of the devil in his numerous forms, in other words, both the intensity and the pervasiveness of his presence, for then argues a constitutional genetic component working in his favour. Aside from merely repeating this article of the present book's faith, let us consider the more detailed features of witch hunting during fairly recent historical times, in particular the behavioural concomitants and the physical marks, the witch marks, associated with being a witch. These were, in no special order, physical misshapeness, stunting, deformity, ugliness, etc., excessive hairiness, especially in women, extending perhaps by a stimulus generalisation, to warts, moles, birthmarks, and so on. Magical practices, often nothing more than an interest in natural medicine, having the second sight, solitariness, hypersexuality, being abroad at night, left-handedness, and so on. One could almost protest that any marked deviance of behaviour or appearance would seem to have been enough to arouse an accusation of witchcraft. But this is not actually true. There is no record, for example, of very tall people or exceptional athletes or warriors being burned as witches. The range of witch qualities, though large, is by no means infinite or all-embracing. In short, do not the main characteristics in question all seem to be possible features exhibited by classic Neanderthal? Yes. I see there's comments from D2017. Hello, D2017. Head ramming. I had no idea. How is modern Cro-Magnon? So the head ramming thing, there's a bit more detail on that later on, I think. How is modern Cro-Magnon so susceptible to propaganda stating the obvious if it's so different from other humans, and the same for the other species, stating the opposite? What? How is modern Cro-Magnon so susceptible to propaganda stating the opposite? Shouldn't it be instinctively obvious that they're different? Why all the successful tricking? Because there aren't really any pure Cro-Magnons anymore. So humans are all hybrids. Every human's a hybrid. And even the ones that have got more Cro-Magnon still have some Neanderthal. We're all hybrids of different. That's what Gooch is proposing, is that the differences in the races are the differences in the hybrids. So that's how we're all capable of fairly similar things, but we've got speciation. And and then Ralph Hexham, Yowies are the Bigfoots of Australia. Yes, Yowies. They see Yowies also seem really dangerous. They seem like the most dangerous one out of all of the Bigfoot type things. They're quite aggressive. I mean, they've probably been there a long time, so they probably don't want to be disturbed. Propaganda, D2017, propaganda stating the obvious. I still don't understand, mate. Sorry. Sorry, new phone. Yeah. Okay. You'll get used to. Hopefully, you'll get used to your new phone. Let me just carry on. Write it in a cohesive. Take your time. Take your time. There's no panic There's no panic on the text here. There's no shortage of text, so take your time. Briefly, it is possible that Western Europeans experience an involuntary urge to destructive action in the presence of certain stimuli or releases, in line with the kinds of involuntary responses to stimuli identified and described in animals by ethologists such as Lorenz, Tinbergen, Barents and others. A chapter will be explicitly devoted to these issues. For the moment, one need mention only that these responses and releases these responses and releases which elicit them are variety specific in some cases, species specific, and so on. That is, particular releases and responses characterize certain groups and not others. They are in fact one of the bases by which we distinguish between varieties. These responses are acquired in the course of the evolution, often obviously the recent evolution of the variety. The reason for their acquisition is that the survival of the individuals who possessed them was thereby somehow promoted, while the survival of those who did not was disfavoured. It is proposed now that the so-called witch marks are releases, or at least the residue of such, specific to the variety of sapients termed Cro-Magnon and his descendants, while the resulting reaction, in its full-fledged form, is a witch hunt. This line of if you've never read any ethology, if you've never seen the field of ethology or read anything about it, it's fascinating. It's like most people haven't heard about ethology, but we can sort of see it all around us all the time. Konrad Lorenz, German ethologist who worked for the National Socialists and then went on to work as just a normal ethologist outside of politics. He's got a good book called On Aggression, worth reading. And then Irenus Eibel-Eibesfeld. There's quite a few Germans actually. Nicole Tinbergen is probably Scandinavian, Norwegian or something. What is basically, I mean, one good example of a ethological stimuli or stimulus and response or releaser. So is the a baby smiling. So babies smile automatically. So it's they don't get taught how to smile. They smile automatically from birth. And what that smile does, you would call that a stimuli. So ethological in ethology that would be a stimuli or a stimulus. So the baby smiles. And the reason the baby smiles is to draw in the parents. So that releases in the parent a feeling of love or, an oxytocin bond or whatever it is. And so the baby gets what it needs out of that. So in order for the baby to survive, it had to develop the smile from birth. It had to know how to smile from birth. Babies that don't smile from birth don't get as much attention, get neglected, whatever else it is, or parents who don't have the releaser in them that reacts to the smile. So there may be parents that are born with a dysfunctional releasing system, and so when the baby smiles, the parents don't respond in the correct way, and the baby gets neglected that way. So there's lots of behaviours of all animals that are, you can imprint on baby ducks by when they hatch out the egg. The first thing that they see, they'll imprint onto, and that will become the parents. They'll follow that thing around. So Konrad Lorenz done all these different experiments with animals. He had a crow. He had his own crow, that used to follow him around and fly above him, making crow noises and warning noises every time it saw anything that it thought might be a danger to Comrade Lorenz. It sounded its like crow sound. So he had it was good. He had ducks following him around. He had ducks that followed dogs. He was a very kindly old gentleman. You can look him up on YouTube, Comrade Lorenz. But it gets covered up a lot because I think because the main thrust of ethology is that the majority of our behaviours are there from birth, and they can, and that means that you're not a product of socialisation. You're a product of genetic, these responses that are pre-programmed in you, sort of thing. But what they do is, in my opinion, what they do is they cover up something like ethology, so you don't really see a lot about it, but then they use it to manipulate you in things like advertising or government or society. So they use these things to engineer society, whilst telling you that everything is down to your social situation. Oh, it's all you can learn to be anything. But yeah, when you look into ethology, you'd see that that's pretty much rubbish. So sociology is a bullshit field. This line of argument may seem more convincing at a later stage. It is now suggested here that a partial explanation of the persistent and savage persecution of Jews, Gypsies, Negroes and others, which has so long been a feature of Western society. Is it perhaps the accidental resemblance of members of the group just named to a long extinct variety of man which triggers in some present-day individuals a very ancient and destructive response, once essential to survival? Whatever the precise facts may be, I am personally persuaded that, say, the attitudes to the Jews in Germany and parallel events in other countries at other times could not have taken so extreme a form or gained such impetus, or for that matter continue to be so broadly vigorous in our society at large, purely on the basis of a body of anecdote or a catalogue of imaginary crimes, and that they must therefore be ascribed to a deep psychological need and an innate psychological response. These innate tendencies are then, of course, susceptible to cultural reinforcement. Just basically what I just said. He's just repeated. I mean, I don't know if I'm just remembering this book really well, but he's basically just said the same thing. Is that trying to blame the European persecution of other groups on social issues is pointless because they're probably genetic, but this last line, these innate tendencies. So he's saying the innate tendencies to persecute other groups of people because they look so much like the natural enemy of Cro-Magnon. These innate tendencies are then, of course, susceptible to cultural reinforcement. So that's the what I was saying about sociology is that they'll tell you that you're a product of sociology whilst they are socially programming your innate responses. So they'll pump up your ethological responses and stimuli. They'll provide you with stimuli so that you react. Another subject worth looking into is the what's it called? Hyperstimulus or supernormal stimulus or whatever it's supernormal stimulus. And that again is to do with ethology, but it's that there's a good example is the coloured eggs of birds. So certain birds lay certain different coloured eggs, but what they've found is that if you do through experimenting, they found that, say, a bird that lays brown spotted eggs will sit on that egg and will nest on the egg, but they really prefer large, like bright blue eggs. So if you painted an egg blue, painted the ball blue, and it was bigger than the egg, that same bird would nest on that egg even harder than it would the brown spotted one. So there are sort of extremes that you can push animals to that are beyond their natural limit. And so you could think of, say, breasts as something like that. That everyone, all men like breasts, but by pumping breasts up, you can push men into like a sort of a place where you're overdriving their ethological releaser. So they become even more stimulated. They become stimulated to a supernormal level by an increased stimulus. And that's how that's one of the things that I think that they do to sort of manipulate us in our societies. They understand that most of our reactions are innate or genetic, and then they program society to be able to manipulate us with those innate responses. I'm going to stop there anyway because I've just realised the times. We've been on probably just over an hour or something. Well, there's a few comments to go through. Everyone's having a bit of a chat up. Ralph Hexham, is it true? Let me just switch back. Hold on. Is it true soy face comes from babies watching people making the same gesture and it becomes imprinted? Is it true soy face comes from the babies watching people making the same gesture? What? So the soy face adults were seeing that as babies. Is that what you're saying? There's got to be some sort of face that I mean, you've got things like the rictus grin, which is where people go and that's like a fear face that people do when they're scared. You see people doing it on fairgrounds and things like that, and that's something that is a response. It's like a thing that's released in people to a stimulus. So you can watch people do the rictus grin when they're on fairgrounds, or even when people are a bit scared. So like soy face is a little bit like the rictus grin in a way. I think, I don't know. So it's sort of like, it's like a sort of a bit scared, a fear face, or it's some sort of submission face, because there was something that was going on during Trump, and that was that people were pulling up the fact that he doesn't smile. So although people like it when someone smiles, they feel like, oh yeah, somebody is smiling. You don't want your leaders to smile, because it sort of shows like a weakness in a way. And so I think soy face again is some kind of, pushing that weakness of smiling to like a point where you're like smiling with your mouth open, and it's really disarming. That's what it is. It's like a face of being totally disarmed, so that the people you're around feel, you think anyway, because all these things are all from you. They're all projections. So like when you're like when someone does a soy face, they're doing it because they think it's going to it's going to help people, make them feel at ease with them around them. But it doesn't. What these things do is they make you feel like this person is a bit soft. The only way out is in. Sociology is absolute projection nonsense. Yeah. The whole socialization narrative is because economics, i.e., mind control, propaganda for the wealth of those with no conscience. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, and yeah, that's what Stan seemed to repeat. That's what I picked up from Stan Gooch. Without their dumb narrative, folk would be closer to the truth. Yeah, Hollywood, celebrity, fashion equals hyper stimulation. Yeah, exactly. So. Yeah, we see that in the celebrity world is that they pump their lips up, they pump their asses up. You know, the camera adds £10, whatever it is. You know, so they're always sort of pumping themselves up to push our responses, so that we're responding to something that's fixed in the mind. So we've got a genetic response to something, and all they do is they play on those responses over and over again. So they by pumping themselves up, pumping their lips up. We know it's grotesque. It goes to the point of grotesqueness once it's gone beyond the point of stimulation. So there's a point between the normal, when someone has a normal pair of lips or a normal pair of breasts or a normal normal body, normal muscles, and then they go into like a sort of pumped up stage where the lips are pumped up, the breasts are pumped up, the body's pumped up, and then it goes into a grotesque, unnatural stage where everything's gone beyond that point of where you feel properly stimulated or overstimulated, and you start to feel fatigued by it. You start to notice its grotesqueness. Clowns, similar sort of thing. Also, the soldiers with the shoulder things on their arms. You know, there used to be a thing in the 80s with Kenny Everett. One of the sketches Kenny Everett used to do, where he had some sort of general in the army, and he had these massive epaulets, they're called, aren't they? Epaulets. He had massive epaulets on his shoulders. So that's to like increase the size of the shoulders. So men have big shoulders. You know, men are meant to have broad shoulders. So generals in the army, to look even more intimidating, add on massive epaulets. And you can see that throughout, you know, the history of Europeans, and even in some other more primitive peoples, you can see that they add stuff to their shoulders to try and make their shoulders look bigger. And that's just something that you can see from far away as well, and that's how you know that these things are genetic, is that they have an effect from far away. So another one that I've always speculated on is the white of your hand. You know, everybody has white hands, white palms of their hands, and from far away, if you wave your hand, it's an obvious signal to anybody. Anyone can see that white hand, and we also have a thing of waving a white flag when you give in. You know, and that's something that people can see from far away. So there's like there's something to do with that light colour that all people have. All people from all around the world have light hands on the palms of their hands, not on the tops of their hands. And you can also use a white flag to give in during to ask for mercy in a fight, or I give in, or whatever, in a battle. And that's what you do. You raise your hands up when you've had enough. I've had enough, and I've had enough. You know, put your hands up. So it's a similar sort of similar sort of thing. It's eliciting some sort of response in people. Trevor Wright, did Cro-Magnon gradually successfully create a sense of community in Europe first before Neanderthals, or after to become a modern man? Did Cro-Magnon gradually... So I was reading Ralph's comments as well. Did Cro-Magnon gradually successfully create a sense of community in Europe first before Neanderthals, or after? No, Cro-Magnon according to Gooch, just went into Europe and took out whatever Cro-Magnon, whatever Neanderthals he could find. Neanderthal was there first. Neanderthal, you know, if you believe the fossil record and all that sort of stuff, Neanderthal was in Europe 250,000 years ago. So actually, he evolved in Europe. The barrel-bodied, hairy Neanderthal evolved in Europe and adapted for the cold weather with his funny big hook nose and hairy eyebrows. And Cro-Magnon comes into Europe from somewhere. We don't know where, but he appears in Europe and then overruns Neanderthal, and then Neanderthal disappears. Or runs away to the mountains, or whatever you want to think. Ralph Hexham, Michelle Obama wears epaulets. That's pretty weird. When you think about all the rumours to do with Michelle Obama as well, and then maybe that's our final nail in the coffin is that even though Michael is trying to make his shoulders look small, he also wears epaulets, which means he's a man. He can't avoid making his shoulders look big. And magicians wear white gloves. Yeah, they do. Magicians wear white gloves. But what are they trying to do? Trying to disarm you. They're trying to put you at ease so that you miss the trick. So there's definitely something about waving white hands in front of people that disarms them. I've never read it anywhere. I've never, this is just my own thoughts on ethology. But it's, well, if you get like half an hour this week, just watch some Conrad Lorenz videos on YouTube. Very interesting. You probably want to read his biography as well on Wikipedia, because you might like him even more if you see where he came from and what he went through and all the rest of it, and why he's not popular. You can see on his Wikipedia why nobody wants to talk about Conrad Lorenz. So anyway, thanks for coming along again and listening and joining in the chat. Trevorn, The Only Way Out Is In, Ralph Hexham, D2017. I think that's it. Just the hardcore, just the hardcore gang tonight. Yeah, thanks for coming along, and I'll see you next Monday. Yeah, okay. If you're on Twitter, let me know who you are. If you're on Telegram, you can go in and join 2 people in there in Telegram. I don't really put much in there, but maybe if more people was in there, I would. All right, anyway, thanks everyone, and bye-bye.